Well, hello and welcome to another porch chat from the cold porch here at Rare Classic Cars. I've talked about GM engines and what are the best and what are the worst, and I have a lot more to talk about on the GM engines, particularly the big blocks of the time. But today we're going to focus on Chrysler engines and what are the worst Chrysler engines, at least in my opinion. Now, as compared to GM, Chrysler didn't really have as many, I'll call them stinkers, when it comes to engines, although they did have some stinkers for transmissions. Not in the old days, but the Ultra Drive 4-speed automatics from I think 1989 through the 90s. Those are really bad. You will find yourself in the dreaded second gear limp home mode quite frequently. So you don't have to necessarily worry about the engine in some of those, but the transmissions aren't great. And I would say that while oftentimes for Chrysler the overall architectures of the motors were great, sometimes they were surrounded by components that weren't the most robust, and that gave way to a poor customer experience. So the fundamentals weren't bad, but the engine itself was good, but its componentry and some of those items really was an Achilles heel. But this first motor, that is by far the number one problematic Chrysler motor of all time that you definitively want to stay away from, is, can anybody guess? The 2.7 liter V6 engine. This went in a lot of Chrysler vehicles from even until the recent past. And it was a good motor on paper. It made about 200 horsepower, went into some of the Chargers and 300s and those vehicles, but it has a key fatal flaw, and that is that it has an internal water pump that tends to leak, which then sludges up the oil, which then basically ruins the engine. And to replace the water pump, this is not an external water pump like most engines. This is an internal water pump that is a bear of a job to replace. And if you don't catch it in time, like I said, you get coolant mixing in the oil and you get all sorts of problems. And consequently, the lifetime for how long these vehicle engines last is typically less than 100,000 miles, because somebody doesn't catch that in time, it leaks. Once you get coolant in the oil, it loses its lubricating properties, and it's all downhill from there. So anything with a Chrysler 2.7 liter V6, my best advice is stay away. Just stay away. Don't touch it, even if it runs good, unless you want to preemptively change the water pump. And it is, like I said, a bear of a job. If you call up shops, don't expect them to quote you low numbers for what it's going to cost you to repair that. It will cost a decent amount of coin. Let's talk about the next one. The next motor here that's on my list isn't really a problem with the fundamental engine. It's a problem with the electronics associated with it, and that's the 1981 to 1983 Imperial fuel-injected 318 V8. Now, the 318 was a Chrysler workhorse for years, excellent motor. You know, it kind of got smogged down and had some issues, not the motor itself, but the control systems in the 80s era and the late 70s era with lean burn, which I'll get to in a second. But this Imperial fuel injection system just took things to a whole new level. And amazingly, the system was engineered by the Chrysler engineers who engineered space shuttle technology. So you would think that these are the brightest of the bright, and I'm sure the engineers probably were. But for whatever reason, the product that they birthed and let out the door was dreadful, and in Chrysler's most expensive car of the time. So what are the issues with it? What are not the issues with it? It was so bad that Chrysler recalled it and offered to convert the cars to carbureted with Carter carburetors for free for the owners. And this is not just a simple, I'll say, carburetor conversion kit, not just a lift and shift to the intake and the carburetor. Dealer converted Imperials have different fuel tanks, fuel tank pumps, they have a revised instrument cluster, they have a whole slew of parts that are different from the fuel injected cars the non-recalled ones. I believe that kit was so expensive, just the parts for the kit, to retrofit it to carburetor, that it cost Chrysler like $1,500 at the time per kit, not counting the labor to redo it. Like I said, it's a different tank, it's a different pump, it's all new. You have to put a new dash cluster in, and then a bunch of underhood changes as well. So any vehicle, what's wrong with this fuel injection system? It's really hard to pinpoint. I would say the biggest thing is the electronics and the electronic sensors are a bit squirrely. And in particular, the motor had a shutdown module. It was so bad that if it sensed certain issues, it would actually turn off the engine. And the only way to restart the car was to put it back in park, full cycle the key, and then restart. So if it stalled, you couldn't put it in neutral and restart. That was not going to work. And one of the issues was that those shutdown modules were not grounded all that well. They grounded out to the sheet metal under hood, and it just not good. I think some of the flow metering, I would say, devices too were unique and challenged. And you particularly don't want one now because finding parts are impossible. As I said, a lot of these cars were retrofitted to carburetors at the dealer, and it's consequently very tough to find any parts for the fuel injection system. So I would stay away from those. 318, great motor. Although not very powerful at this time, but very reliable and durable. But that fuel injection system was not great. Third, again, not so much an issue with the motor itself, but early lean burn vehicles. So as the emissions era came in, Chrysler introduced what they called the lean burn system. And the whole premise was that it would reduce emissions by having the cars run purposefully lean. So optimal air-to-fuel ratio on vehicles is around 14.7 to 1. 14.7 parts of air to 1 part of fuel. And these lean burns would run at around 18 to 1. And they had quite fancy electronics for the times. The carburetors have throttle position sensors. They have engine coolant temperature sensors. They all had a spark control module that was part of the air cleaner assembly, which we can debate whether or not that's great to put a computer under hood on the air cleaner, getting a lot of thermal cycling. And that was another failure point. But these cars just ran quite lean. Consequently, they didn't run very well and didn't have great power. Now, again, the motors that they were attached to, the 440s, 400s, and other Chrysler V8s were not bad. Were actually very good engines. But the drivability really suffered, and it's hard to tune those. I'll still call it a lean burn successor. I have an 83 Grand Fury with a similar setup. And from the factory, they kind of run lean. They're boggy. You step into it and not much else happens. But the good thing, at least on the Carter 2-barrel carburetors, is you can take a little access plate off the top, and then there's a control for the metering rods that moves them up and down. And you can rotate the positioning of the metering rods to make it run richer or leaner if you want. Excuse me. So one big improvement that I did to my 83 Grand Fury was actually two things. One, these cars, in addition to running lean, typically have very retarded spark timing, again for emissions. So retarded spark timing, lean fuel mixtures, not great performance, bogginess, bad. So I took the cover off and I moved the metering rods to, in effect, allow them to raise sooner so the mixture is richer, i.e. making it a non-lean burn carburetor, in effect. And then I also advanced the timing. Now, one thing you do have to do when you advance the timing on these is recognize that for lean burn carburetors, for every 30 seconds that your foot is on the throttle, not off the throttle, it advances the spark timing more and more, so that you actually get more spark advance if you're on the freeway and you get better economy. But if you're driving around town for emissions purposes, the spark advance never really gets to its maximum potential. So when you can't just purely rotate the distributor and time it based on if you hear spark knock or not, because you may not hear spark knock driving around town, but the second you go on the freeway and you go on a long freeway trip and then you get off, or you stay on the freeway, you may hear spark knock from the motor because the computer is advancing the spark timing curve. So that took me maybe a week to get quite right what the optimal point was where I could advance it, but not so much that if I took a long freeway trip, it would not continue, it would not spark knock. But, I shouldn't arguably have to do that. And then it totally changed the car. I mean, it was a dog before. It had a 318, again, reliable motor, but it really couldn't get out of its own way. And now it'll chirp the tires if I step on the gas pedal, and has, I would say, good torque, feels peppy even, and it certainly didn't before. Those cars also, like the M bodies, had a 2.2 to 1 rear end ratio, which really, really tall. So that brings up one other point, which I can talk about. The engines aren't necessarily that bad. Some of the Chrysler rear ends, not their typical rear ends, but the 7 1/4 rear ends, not good. But on balance, my list for Chrysler engines is not that long. Quite a few of the engines are good. Like I said, be careful of the ultra drive 4-speed automatics. Stay away from the 2.7 liter V6. Stay away from the Imperial with the fuel injected V8. And you want one, if you get an Imperial, you want one that is a dealer converted 318. You don't want the somebody who's taken the intake off and redone it. There's too many electronics in that car, like with the gauge cluster and everything, that some people do it fine and some people don't. My advice would be to find one with the factory dealer conversion, and you can tell when it's a dealer conversion. It has the correct air cleaner snorkel, the heat stove tube, the spark control computer on the air cleaner, etc. And then the lean burn system, I wouldn't say you necessarily have to stay away from those, but you have to play with them and fiddle with them to get them to run right. And that was true even back in the day. They were not the best running vehicles. So hope you enjoyed that relatively brief list of worst Chrysler engines forever. Some people put the 2.2 4-cylinder, 2.5 4-cylinder from the A's on there. I don't think that belongs on the worst engines list. Is it a great motor? Maybe not, but they were pretty reliable for the time and not bad when you look at the other engines that the domestics were offering. So that'll be my list. Thanks again. Stay tuned for more. Thanks for watching this video about some of Chrysler's less than stellar engines. Hope you enjoyed. Please check out my other videos, including some that I made on the best and worst General Motors engines and one on the North Star thus far. Please like and subscribe, and also put some comments in the bottom on what your thoughts are. You can subscribe by clicking the circular icon with the 67 Buick Riviera at the top left. Thanks again for watching.